Thank you very much to Elise and Patrick for the kind invitation. Yeah, and allowing me to speak about pre-digital culture in your post-digital culture conference. Yeah, so to present this material that I've been working on, and this is just a very small part of some research that I'm doing right now on Sigfried Giedion and this book that he wrote called Mechanization Takes Command. He actually wrote it in English in 1948, and it wasn't even translated into German until the 80s. And so everyone knows what patents are. So they're kind of these temporary exclusionary kind of rights to commodify an invention. So that's what I'll be talking about today. And let me know if I go over time and if there's 5 minutes more here. So in Swiss architecture historian Sigfried Giedion's Mechanization Takes Command from 1948, patent inventions, mainly from the US, constitute one of the main sources of evidence contributing to his so-called anonymous history. So here's an example of a patent. It's kind of like 2 pages. One is a kind of drawing of the invention, and the other is a description, and it's always signed. And what's interesting too is that patents are, they're always a national thing. So it's not just about someone creating an idea, but it's always kind of a national-based thing. So it kind of marries the kind of, let's say, creativity with a national identity. And the other thing that I think is really interesting about patents too is that it's a document that announces an invention, but it doesn't actually have to exist in reality. So as a kind of evidence for history, it's about writing an evidence of things that don't really exist or don't necessarily have to exist. The book discusses in detail the various mechanical implements introduced into European and North American daily life since the 19th century. By the time of his writing, we have increased exponentially our dependence on these technologies, and Giedion's broader message is one of caution, as he observes the delamination of what he calls thought and feeling, of the widening gulf between the rational and emotional self he spoke about 9 years earlier in his talk at Harvard, which became Space, Time, and Architecture, his famous book from 1941. Written soon after the horrors of the Second World War, Mechanization Takes Command is famous for the chapters on the mechanization of death, subtitled Meat. So starting with Haussmann's push for better hygiene in the French abattoirs in the 1860s, to the mechanization of slaughter in Chicago and Cincinnati, to the grisly machines that are used to spear, debristle, flay, and butcher live hogs, Giedion ends the section by drawing comparisons to art. So this is a patent for a machine that scrapes the hair off of a pig as it goes through the machine. To my knowledge, this machine hasn't actually been built, but this is the kind of thing that you'd often find in patent offices. So people imagine machines that could be inventions. Let's see, where do I hold this? Yeah. Against the machinic logic, Giedion points out that death, as evoked by Luis Buñuel in his surrealist film Le Chien Andalou, actually I'm just going to fast forward to that. As evoked by Luis Buñuel in his surrealist film Le Chien Andalou, death is by nature irrational. If not entirely inhumane, machinic rationality is indifferent to the metaphysical dimensions of life and death. Practice and tradition would have us killing the pig before butchering it. Killing before butchering is logically and rationally unnecessary. So this patent, this machine you see, it's kind of a hook that hooks the pig onto a kind of conveyor belt while it's still alive, and then it cuts it in half while it's still alive. Because you don't to butcher a pig, you don't need to kill it first. Is the kind of idea. So this was in 1948, right? He was writing this. As machines remove humanity from industrial processes, so too does Giedion distance human intention from the context of the physical world. Quote, the sole purpose of the drawings in the patent office is to illustrate the patent claim as clearly as possible. Yet freely viewed in this continuity, without regard to their technical interpretation and significance, they strike us as a danse macabre of our time, unquote. Giedion continues by saying that the patent's purposiveness is too direct. Unlike the personifications of death in art, most often as a hooded, described, kind of shown, represented as a hooded skeleton figure wielding a sickle. Death, patented, as a matter of bureaucratic cataloging. Patents protect intellectual property, and to see the legal similarities between patents and the tangible objects they describe allows mechanization takes command to enter the architectural discourse, or the slow, quote, slow shaping of our daily lives. So he's interested in all these objects so this is the end rationalization of a cow, so it's a can of beef. So he's interested in the things that surround us, not just buildings. And it's interesting to note that, Andreas showed all these images or kind of interpretations of modern architecture, and Giedion was one of the biggest, most vocal mouthpieces for modern architecture, like Corbusier and Gropius. As one of modern architecture's most prominent mouthpieces, Giedion's use of patents in writing a history of mechanization warrants particular attention. What is the purpose of discussing objects that no one uses or has yet to use? And how does nationality and commerce enter into Giedion's argument through the U.S. Patent Office? And most importantly, what does it mean to write a history of things that do not exist? Mechanization Takes Command is decidedly ambivalent about the impact of machines on the lived world. As a book that seeks to discover the meaning of history by uncovering relationships, Giedion concludes his analysis with a man-machine double bind. Mechanization, like fire or water, is morally neutral, and it is dependent on man to wield it for either good or evil. So this is Giedion's interpretation. And as I use the word mechanization, you can, as a thought experiment, interchange it with the word technology and see what happens. The machines that Giedion discusses are those that he finds to have a direct presence in our daily lives. Tables, chairs, stoves, sinks, showers, and other related household objects are discussed in terms of their mechanical development, while agriculture and meat processing is discussed in the way they have adopted the scientism of assembly lines. The first mechanical device discussed in length in his book is the lock. And the book is, I should say, about like 750 pages long. He really goes into quite a lot of detail, and there's about 500 images in it. So the first mechanical device discussed in length is the lock. Opening the book's 8 chapters with a lock, unlocking it as it were, establishes the rhetorical purpose of household things, readable as both the object and the method of analysis. Giedion's arguments are not often stated in the expository arc afforded by the thesis, example, conclusion structure. In general, each object or process Giedion considers is discussed as a history from its early, sometimes ancient implementation to the end of the 19th century when mechanization indeed takes command. So this is him going through the Yale lock, and then he ends by showing this painting by Leger. In the 5th section of the book, called Mechanization Encounters Human Surroundings, Giedion lays out 2 millennia of the history of furniture, zooming in from the Middle Ages till the first decade of the 20th century. Unlike the slaughterhouse, furniture affects our daily and immediate lives. Quote, furniture numbers among the utensils most intimately bound up with man's existence. With it he lives day and night. It assists his work and rest, unquote. Chairs, benches, tables, drawers, commodes, and bureaus of the 15th century onwards are discussed in terms of their form, transportability, and comfort level offered. Here, mechanization is also spoken of as a pathology, and in studying how it has infected our intimate surroundings, we need to identify its symptoms. Obvious symptoms, quote, will often show how mechanization confused the human environment, unquote. Falsification is a telltale feature of industrial processes, exhibiting, quote, symptoms such as the industrial reproduction of art objects, the counterfeiting and adulteration of handicraft methods, and decaying sense of materials. So Giedion reprints an image of a mid-19th century electroplated plant-themed candle holder from Henry Cole's Journal of Design. So its base is a broadleaf, the candle stands on is a blossom, and the handle is a head of a nymph. A surreal combination of parts, kind of for me, evoking something that Andreas showed earlier, this kind of weird hybrid of things put together, just kind of found. For Giedion, this mass-produced object expresses less about its function than it reveals about its observer. So this is the type of object that really confounded Giedion. It's a mass-produced object, and it allows a kind of like cheap processing to make this form, and then it's electroplated to look like something else. But in this kind of mechanization, he's suggesting that things like this kind of weird hybrid of forms become possible. So it's almost like a monster, right? When Giedion turns to patent furniture of the mid-19th century, furniture designed chiefly by engineers rather than furniture makers, he remarks on both their novelty, a required feature for patents, and their ability to accommodate our range of postures. Industrial production has multiplied the number of variations available for each part of the furniture. With each component of the patent object drawn as a kit of parts, quote, dissected into separate elements, into separate planes, these movable elements, governing mechanism linked and regulated, enabled the furniture to change in an adaptation to the body in various postures, unquote. As you can see there. In fact, if mechanization and industrialization is concerned with quote, growth and development, not to be confused with progress, the patent furniture's ability to adapt to our needs makes it, quote, the constituent furniture of the period. Patent and thus rationalized, mechanized furniture is a constituent of our changing needs. To the seemingly infinite permutations of patent furniture parts, there is no reason why our furniture could not adapt and serve all our various physical needs. A chair was no longer a fixed type, but a model or archetype for more specific use. As a collection, the typewriter chair, sewing machine chair, chaise lounge, wheelchair, rocking chair, rotating chair, surgical chair, barber chair, all 19th century variations resulted from technical improvements on the type, suggest that our needs and comforts could be met with mechanical processes. Patents don't reflect a need, but anticipate one. And in terms of satisfying the body, they mobilize technology to accommodate any number of future positions. So this is these hybrid convertible things that he's talking about. It's a chair that becomes a ladder. Here's a barber chair, an invalid's chair, and a chair that adjusts to different body positions. In the section of the book called Metamorphosis in Mechanics, Giedion writes of unnatural hybrids. So think of that plant candle holder, nymph head thing I showed you. Just as in the myth of antiquity, this is him writing now, just as in the myth of antiquity, a man is changed to a stone or a tree, and nature is peopled by creatures half horse, half man, half fish, half man, half snake, half man, so that there is no telling where the animal ends and where the human begins. Likewise, in the singular creations known as patent furniture, it is almost impossible to tell where one category ends and where the next begins. They dissolve into one another. Multiformity and metamorphosis are part and parcel of their being. An armchair that changes into a couch that changes into a cradle, can justly be termed combination furniture, and as can a bed that turns into a sofa, into a chair, into a table, into a railway seat. Everything is collapsible, foldable, revolving, telescopic, recombinable. Where does this part end and where does it begin? No sooner have we reached a clean-cut verdict than all is shuffled afresh, leading to no end. The reason lies in the nature of the furniture. Part merges as part with part, as in the mermaid, fish, and woman. They fuse into a new unity. So clearly he's really confused by all this, right? The utility of accommodation is shown to be grotesque when objects become ontologically unstable. Hybrid objects cannot provide a stable meaning, and in the fungibility of the combination furniture's forms and purpose, and the, quote, coupling of the most dissimilar objects, what is at first humorous can also, quote, lapse into the grotesque. This is a bed that is also a piano. From 1866. This is not to say that all multi-purpose furniture fell into this category, and there are examples of things that are very useful, which I won't get into. The logic of moving and rest are improbably combined in the patent for a hammock and a tricycle hybrid. Giedion selected this object in part to show his incredulity over how something as simple as a complete as a hammock is not impervious to the creative forces of the patent. Of pre-Columbian Caribbean origin, the hammock, when combined with a rotary Coventry tricycle, its large front wheels, a hallmark of Victorian urbanism, becomes a crossbreed collapsing rural and metropolitan categories. It matters little to Giedion whether proposals like these were successful in practice. What matters here is to show the imagination, impetuous and even bordering on ludicrous, that was at work to release the furniture from its rigidity. Giedion views the U.S. patent improvements on the hammock as evidence of an American instinct to master equilibrium, evoking Alexander Calder's mobile to illustrate his theory. The slightest movement of air alters the relationship between the mobile's hanging parts, and their movement unpredictable yet strictly adheres to both physical laws and a machinic logic. Of the legal, machinic, and bureaucratic world, and often remaining unrealized and immaterial, a grotesque and ludicrous patent functions like artwork and can offer insight into how mechanization or technology and bureaucracy collides with our creativity. Giedion's description of the mobile's ever-changing constellation of parts recalls his conception of, quote, contemporary history, the notion introduced in Space, Time, and Architecture in 1941 as an interpretation of constantly moving parts, like reading meaning in the changing configuration of stars. So what he calls contemporary history is also the charge to look at all development of daily life, not just the established canon. In this view, the hammock is eminently comparable to Calder's mobile, as they both indicate a similar impulse to set objects in natural and mechanical balance. And as models of history, they show that there's no absolute standpoint and no privileged perspective. And this idea of that ultimate comparability or absolute comparability, I think we'll see in Katya's work too, where she compares the Mars rover with birds and dolphins with weapons and so on. If Giedion's message earlier in the book, particularly when discussing the processing of meat, is one of caution in the face of increased mechanization, then by the end he's an advocate for balance. As he stated elsewhere in the book, mechanization is neutral, but maintaining that, quote, one must discriminate between those spheres that are fit for mechanization and those that are not. On page 721, so at the end of the book, Giedion emphasizes a series of epigrams about the need for balance by graphically inserting a line break in the sentence. You can see here that he breaks the sentences in his typography. We must establish a new balance between so this is him writing, we must establish a balance between the individual and the collective sphere. We must establish a new balance between the physical sphere within the individual. We must establish a new balance between the spheres of knowledge. We must establish a new balance between the human body and cosmic forces. As he's establishing in other writing, Giedion sees history as a continuous project. Living hour by hour, like a clock perhaps, quote, does not merely lack dignity, it is neither natural nor human. It leads to a perception of events as isolated points rather than a part of a process with dimensions reaching out into history. Continuity is thus a way of seeing an uninterrupted process and a call to insert oneself into the force of shaping the present. The break displayed in these lines represents not so much a rupture caused by mechanization, but perhaps a catharsis, a moment that reminds us of the holistic equipoise necessary for human life. The consistent use of American patents as historical evidence, featuring the most extreme renditions of American resourcefulness, must have been received as a kind of political stance when the book was published in 1941 in English. In hindsight, to bequeath patents a pride of place with art and the status of constituent fact harkens to the famous quote by one of Giedion's favorite artists, Paul Klee, that art doesn't reproduce the visible, but makes visible. By way of reading history, patents, exaggerations of present impulses or stand-ins of future realizations, offers a narrative in the future perfect tense, a future as imagined by those in the past. Thank you.